Hi there, this is Michael Becker. And in our conversation today, with me is Justin Bryant. And we're going to be talking about the personal data and identity marketplace and specifically drilling into kind of the legal regulatory framework views of it. Justin is a recent Stanford grad and will be soon starting up as a cybersecurity and privacy lead at a law firm in a few months. And I wanted to take an opportunity for us to discuss his views and research that he's done in this field, particularly in looking at the regulatory frameworks in Africa. So let's jump right in. Justin, thank you very much for joining me.
Great to be here, Michael. Thanks for having me.
And maybe you can fill in some of the gaps a little bit on the bio that I just so quickly went through. You can explain to me a little bit about, and the audience, who you are, what you're doing, and at a top level, what are your views in this current state of and the emerging, evolving new economy that we call personal data and identity.
Sure thing. So my name is Justin Bryant. I went to Duke University as an undergrad where I studied public policy and information science. And kind of there, I became really interested in the overlap between those areas and in many respects. And that kind of led me to the work that I'm doing today. I always took a global approach to these issues. So after undergrad, I decided to do a master's in Beijing, China, the Schwarzman Scholars Program, which was a program that was really focused on looking at a lot of different geopolitical issues around the world and had a very good global and diverse community of young people talking about kind of these issues and forward-looking ways to conceive of this. And after I left there, I went to law school at Stanford, wanting to be in the Bay Area to kind of make my intervention in tech policy generally, but I particularly grew close to personal data space. And a lot of the research that I've done lately has been in Africa, because I guess while I was in China, I got really interested in the relationship between China and Africa. There's been a lot of talk about sort of the infrastructure investments that the Chinese have made in Africa over the last several decades. But I was really interested in how this would be leveraged in the digital space and what this would mean kind of from like a neo-colonialist perspective of how, Africans coming into greater purchasing power, being a very young continent, would be able to contend in the face of a lot of these very rigid demands of these Chinese investments in the tech space, and also the cultural norms that come with that as well. And kind of the way I see it is that you have sort of three major philosophies toward the internet and toward data generally. You have one coming out of Europe, the GDPR kind of centric framework that places individual rights as foremost in this personal data ecosystem. And you have the American model, which is very kind of segmented regulatorily, but you don't have a whole lot of individual rights focused there. It's more about corporations are kind of preeminent. And then you have sort of the East Asian model in China, which is more authoritarian, very government focused, very government driven way. And when you look at Africa, they're kind of at the center of all of these models. And there's competition on the continent for like which of these models is kind of going to be preeminent there. And so that is really interesting to me. And I kind of
can I pause you there? Let's talk about that.
Sure, go ahead.
So I too have seen that kind of view of the three lenses for regulatory models.
Yeah.
And I want to run something by you and see what you think of that. So yeah, I too will, when you look at the European model, I often call that the self-sovereign model. It's an omnibus legal framework where the individual is the center and all market sectors must adhere to the rights of the individual. Appropriate label for that?
I'd say, yeah.
Okay. The second one, I loved your comment of it being corporate centric in the US. What I often refer to, or the label I've called it, is the open data model. And in the open data model, it's he or she who finds the asset, the gold, the oil, in this case, the data, owns it. And it's very corporate asset appropriate. Moreover, it's sectoral. If I find it in the healthcare market versus in the automotive market versus in the financial market versus out there in the wild, very, very different, rules apply, in that regard. And so it's very analogous to the the US wild west, right? Go west, stake your claim, and if you can fight it off, you own it, right? And that's the US approach. Do you agree? You're laughing, or
That's, I'd say, and I'd say that's how we've done things, right? A lot of people will talk about it as a sectoral approach, but really, yeah, what it is that, like you said, it is kind of the Wild West. It is kind of that very corporate, entrepreneurial perspective that we have in the U.S. and not trying to come down in a heavy-handed way like we see Europeans doing necessarily.
Yeah, and again, just an analogy there too is like the European model is here are the rules and what you're allowed to do, right? And the US model is here are the rules and what you're not allowed to do. And so go do everything you want. And then if you go over the line, we'll retroactively tell you you're not allowed to do that anymore.
Absolutely. And it's
right?
definitely the reverse. It's the reverse in Europe, where they give you what is appropriate and you don't do what is outside of what is appropriate. Absolutely.
Right. And our model is we give you what you absolutely can't do. Anything else is good until we tell you you can't. Fair game. Right. And I think very different approaches. And then for lack of a better term, the term I put on the East Asian model, as you put it out, is I call it the social engineering model, where we're essentially using the technology and the regulatory frameworks and the legal frameworks, if you will, to essentially manipulate and engineer the social behaviors we want within our society. China being an example with its social credit scoring system, and the kind of the myth. I don't know if it's urban legend or not, but you hear about the stories where the CCTV cameras are monitoring people, and if they catch them jaywalking, their social score goes down.
Look, I mean, I live there, right? And I'll tell you, it's very invasive, right? And there's no way around that. And you're absolutely right. They are going about the sort of social engineering of the sort of behaviors and sort of allegiances that they wish to produce, right? I mean, outside of this kind of model, you see what's going on now with regards to tech companies. And these are very profitable organizations. These are very global brands. Some of China's most foremost global brands. And the government is just saying that we are, you're not going to succeed beyond what we allow. And for us in America, it's kind of wild that they would do something like this, but they know exactly what's in their interests in this regard and what they want. And so it's fascinating.
Yeah. And again, it's a different allow than the European model. The European model is more about allow for the protective of the agency and sovereignty of the individual. And the East Asian model of the allow seems to be more along the allow of what I, the government, want, not necessarily for what's better for the individual, but what's better for the collective, to which I define as our society.
Right.
So I guess so in that regard, it's Europe is about individual, American model is about corporations, and the East Asian model is about the social collective, aka government, as defined by the state.
Right.
Yeah, as determined by the state. And then what I hear you're saying is the African model is kind of an emerging hodgepodge of all of those. And what I would argue is even in the US model, and I think every market in some capacity has all three running. The question is, what's the predominant view? So like even in the US, we have the open data model, we have the self-sovereign model, aka the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, and about 10 or 11 other states that are enacting something similar. But we also have the social engineering model. We call it the credit score, right? We are doing social mechanics in a way, and we have it in terms of even some of the other advertising and data brokerage models that we have in the US that evaluate people, and so we have some of those social engineering tools here too. We just don't use them as blanket. We use them more precisely than say in other markets around the world.
I would agree with that.
I would or would not. I'm sorry.
No, I said I would agree with that to a certain extent, right? I think you have a somewhat convergence of the European model and the kind of sectoral model that we've discussed happening in the United States right now, as that sort of individual rights focused model becomes more in vogue, right? I think a lot of the values that created that model in Europe are shared by a lot of consumers and everyday people in the United States, and are not, and people are not just kind of satisfied with kind of the default of how we've designed things. And so I think that, especially in the wake of the distrust of big tech from everyday people, from politicians, things like that, there have been a lot of questions about the way that we've regulated them on a variety of fronts, not only this, but in terms of like antitrust and stuff like that. And I think that that's sort of what's fostering, you know, the movement we see in the CCPA in Virginia and Nevada and all the states that are moving toward more elements of sort of a GDPR style model.
Well, and frankly, the analogy I use for that, have you ever been to the Amazon?
I've never been to the Amazon. It's definitely on a bucket list.
So there's an amazing natural phenomena that happens in the Amazon called the meeting of the waters. And what happens is when two rivers meet, you have the Rio Negro meeting with the Amazon River. And when the two rivers meet, they don't actually merge, and because they have different speeds, temperatures, and densities. And so one river is this black river filled with all of this rich organic material that's coming up out of the jungle. And the other river is this like coffee, cappuccino, latte covered mud river coming up out of the mountains. And when the two rivers meet, because they have different speeds, temperatures, and densities, they don't merge. And so when you see a picture of them, half the river's black and half the river's a cappuccino. And they coexist in the same riverbed for 5 miles, right? And because it takes that long for the attributes and the properties of the rivers to come back together and merge back visually to be the same river. And I use that analogy of what's happening in nature to talk about like what's happening here, right? We don't just have two rivers, we have multiple rivers merging into the same riverbed of people engagement. And half the rivers has a certain set of attributes. Another part of the river's got another set of attributes. Another part of the river's got another set of attributes. And, you know, and that's, you know, additional rivers are merging in all the time, but it's at this moment in history where we have two, you know, multiple mega rivers merging in such that they're not actually fully merging yet. And it's going to take many, many years for this kind of big tech capital surveillance, surveillance capitalism model, with the individual model, with the social engineering model, with all of the underlying undercurrents that are driving those. They'll all come together in the last year or two, including one of those undercurrents being consumer awareness of what's happening and the realization and recognition of what's happening, and that people very well may need to, at an individual level, do something about it, and not, you know, trust the government or trust companies, but actually take personal accountability and authority to do something about it. That's one of the undercurrents that's driving that. And I think over time, in the next 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to see those rivers come together. And when they do, we'll then have another established norm for how many more periods of years until the next set of rivers come into play. But we're in that unique time, a unique point in time where, you know, we can actually visually see the distinctions now in a very big way, much like you can at the meeting of the waters in the Amazon.
Absolutely, I think that's right on. I think that, you know, it sort of tees up, you know, what I feel like is going on in Africa, which is a bit different, right? I think in Africa, what you have right now is sort of a regional alignment, if you will, right? And that's kind of what is animating the sort of diverse, well, somewhat diverse approaches that you're seeing on the continent, right? So in my research, I kind of contend that a large part of African data privacy and protection laws are coming kind of directly out of GDPR. It's kind of just a copy paste. And the reason is primarily, in my opinion, because Europe is the largest trading partner with Africa in terms of the European Union bloc. You have the colonial ties that have been there, that remain, and they're still very much dependent on them for trade flows and stuff like that. And so obviously you want to make sure that your legislation is compatible with the areas where your economy is largely dependent. But then you also
And let me
have,
pause you right there too, just for those that may be listening to this. And is when we say Africa, what we're saying is the entire continent. There's 54 unique countries
absolutely.
in this content. And when you say legislation, you're referring to the legislation that each of those 54 individual countries are actually adopting, and they're not necessarily all equal.
Certainly not. They're all in very different stages. Some are more advanced. Some were adopted, in the early 2000s and have been updated. Some have not been updated. Some have been funded with the regulator and have been enforced. Others, kind of, a law was put on the books and nothing was done to enforce it. There are all sorts of different stories across the continent with regards to these laws, where they came from, who put them into action, where they're placed within the regulatory ecosystem, and what that means for their likelihood of being enforced. It's actually a very interesting story when you're able to look at them all kind of next to each other.
Yeah, and that's actually a project you've recently, at least for 32 of them, my understanding is that you recently undertook, yes?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I worked with an organization in Johannesburg called Alt Advisory. They're a really interesting public-private partnership kind of firm. And what they do is they focus on digital rights, and they they have some clients that they service that they use to fund the rest of the efforts of the firm that are basically totally public interest in human facing. And when I was there, I partnered with them on a project called Data Protection Africa, and we created a digital interactive portal that showcased the laws of 32 different countries, as you said. And at the time, we had some countries that seemed like they kind of had things in order. They had regulator funding, and the law was being enforced. We had some countries that were kind of on their way. We had countries that had passed fractions of laws. We had some countries with draft laws in place. Other countries that looked like they were, moving in that direction. And then we had some countries that did not have any laws at all. Maybe some conversations that started, but nothing really had changed in that regard. And since I did that, more laws have been passed on the continent, and the stories have continued to sort of multiply. There have been countries that realized their law was not what they wanted it to be, or there was a mistake in the way that they passed it, and have gone back and made edits and things like that. So it's just been very dynamic, and it's going to continue to be dynamic in the next few years.
Okay. And what was your key takeaway about? Can we dig into that a little bit more about you were talking about when I interrupted you, when companies or these regions or countries are pulling these different European laws in. When you and I had talked last week briefly about this, you noted that we're losing some of the local sensitivity and cultural implications for just simply adopting some of these regulatory laws. Can you give us some insights about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So my perspective is that these African countries, by and large, are adopting the sort of like GDPR style laws for very different reasons than the European Union adopted these GDPR style laws. So the GDPR came out of a lot of conversations within Europe among European stakeholders, thinking about the problems that Europeans were facing, and what privacy meant to Europeans in a very Western conception of privacy. And that was iterated over many years. Before you had the GDPR, you had the Data Protection Directive in 1995. And that was a law that was then updated. And it was just a continuation of the conversation that had been going on for decades. And here, as we see African countries, starting to develop innovation ecosystems, starting to have startups, and really get into this tech space, and have their companies, switching to digital formats and wanting to maintain trade flows with Europe, and also just be globally, recognized as being a safe place for data. You have them largely just copying and pasting provisions of the GDPR into their laws, titling them something slightly different. And a lot of the times they're getting help with the implementation and drafting of these laws from their former colonial powers. So a lot of what you see in West Africa is a lot of the help of CNIL, the French Data Protection Organization, that has helped these West African countries kind of come into harmony with France and the ecosystem that they have there. And this is good in some ways, right? For these economic reasons, but it's also not necessarily the best approach, because for laws to really take root in society, they have to have buy-in from the citizens. And there's a theory in international law called transplant effect that kind of addresses this exact phenomenon, right? When laws are just sort of transplanted from a different country into another country that has, different social situations, there can be difficulty with implementation and difficulty with citizens really understanding the purpose of the law and bringing it into its full effective capacity. And so that's kind of where I come in, right? Because a lot of these countries have sort of hybridized frameworks for privacy, right? Collectivism is a big part of the way that many of the people in these countries live their lives. And that's also kind of hybridized with, a more Western individual perspective, but it doesn't really map onto exactly what you see in Europe. And I think the important part of bringing about this legislation is those sort of conversations with stakeholders. And in my research, I'm just not really convinced that a lot of those conversations were had fully to, in the case of promulgating these laws, such that they would meet the nation where it is in a lot of cases.
Fantastic. And I can later, what URL would people go to if they want to see that? The data protection.
Oh, so the URL is just dataprotection.africa, www.dataprotection.africa.
Okay.
Check it out. So, it's really cool.
So this whole conversation is kind of set up the background for this emerging market that is personal data. And what we've been talking about is each market and identity, and each market uses it in different ways. And there's that whole idea of identity, which resolves to me as a human, and varying levels of identity of I generally know who you are, to very specifically and cryptographically, I know who you are digitally, to the whole sea of attributes about me and how those are managed in ways. And from what I'm understanding in the research I've been doing, is that plays itself out, technologically and operationally very differently in every country, in every region, even within Europe for that matter. So within this emerging personal data marketplace, can you tell me a little bit about what is it you think that, the collective we, and I'll say corporate executives, governmental executives, public interest organization executives, and people need to know? What do we need to know about what's happening now, what's going to happen next, and where do we go from here?
That's a huge question, Michael. It's a huge question. What do we need to know? I think, I guess one of the things I think you need to know is that, there are just going to be a ton more people coming online in the developing world. And a lot of younger people in the developing world are digital natives, right? And so this is going to create a very different, I think, you always have the tension of regulation being behind innovation and kind of being behind where the population is and their needs for that. And I think that as you have, this growing population of digital natives, that is just going to be exacerbated in such a way that cannot be ignored. And we're going to have to figure out ways to iterate faster when it comes to regulation for the technological space. And I think that's also why you see big tech companies like Facebook making commercials about regulation. I was watching TV the other day, and I saw a Facebook commercial for tech regulation. I don't even remember what it was. I'll find it on YouTube or something like that. But I just thought it was absolutely wild because I'd never seen anything like that before. And these companies, obviously, they're some of the biggest lobbying powers in DC, and they want to be a part of the conversation. They want to get ahead of it so they can help write the laws, obviously for their own benefit. But I think that this space is just going to be hot, not just in the US, but around the world, as this becomes just too big to sit on or drag on. It's going to be urgent, and you're going to need sharp people who understand the issues and who have had the conversations with the stakeholders. as I've been talking about, to meet the needs of the population. And if you haven't had those conversations and haven't been focusing on them, you're going to be left behind and your economy is going to lag.
And what is it you think they need to understand? Like, what is it? Local concerns, healthcare issues, financial issues, privacy rights? I mean, what is it that we need to understand?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above, right? Depending on where you're serving, you're going to need to know the local concerns of the population, right? You're going to need to know, sort of, I guess I have this model that I proposed in my paper of sort of digital governance liaisons that kind of have the ear to the ground of local societies in sub-Saharan Africa to kind of let them know what their needs are in the technological space. There just needs to be greater channels of communication because there are going to be a lot of needs, and a lot of people are going to have eyes they don't currently have to see what's going on. Economic inclusion is obviously a huge component, right? A lot of these developing countries are starting on cryptocurrency exchanges and things like that. There's going to need to be a lot of people savvy with how to regulate those sort of markets. And right now, we don't have those people. In a lot of these countries, when they see things starting to take off, things starting to get, in a way that they're out of control of, they'll shut down the exchanges. And in places like Nigeria, which is, I believe, the world's largest peer-to-peer cryptocurrency exchange market, that's going to be increasingly untenable, right? That's just, it's going to be just not possible to do things that way.
Interesting. And what was the question I was going to ask? Is so, what do we need to do then? Like, what happens next, right? So if we know that more people are coming online digitally, so and therefore more attributes about us are being collected, more identities are going to need to be managed, and that's the question I was going to ask you. I mean, in addition to like kind of like this economic inclusion element and all of these other pieces, like what's the point of regulation? So what I've heard thus far, you were saying part of the point of the regulation is to facilitate and create a framework for ease of trade between regions. And so there's their commercial opportunity, but it sounds like what I'm also kind of hearing, the undertone is the point of regulation is to protect both the society at large and the individual at a micro level against harm, both seen and unseen, both perceived and not unknown at this point. Would that be correct?
That'd be correct, right? I mean, I think that's kind of what you expect governments to be able to do, right? And I guess the larger point that I'm trying to make is that if governments don't have these sort of capacities going forward and don't really invest in developing them, they're not going to be able to govern their countries effectively, because the old ways, the traditional, functions, national security, finance, everything is being upended right now. And you've seen some of this through the pandemic, as it's accelerated, but it's really just a trend that's not going to stop. And so I think if governments are not thinking about this and putting resources into developing these capacities, it will be detrimental.
So that's the governments need to know, and the companies need to know is that this kind of change is coming, and that you're either on the train and participating with the regulatory development or off. And
I think so.
So you're either enjoying the meal or you are the meal. I guess
or both, right? Both to some extent, right? I guess the days of free lunch are coming to an end, right? And as you've seen, like through big tech companies jumping on the bandwagon, and that's another interesting contrast, right? Like the problems of, or not problems, right? But the positionality of like larger established tech entities and like smaller players, and the competition that is not just going to be focused on like how the new parameters are set with regards to the regulation, right? And when you have these big players at the table, what does that mean? What does that mean for the smaller players trying to come up if they can't, have their voice heard either? So I think they need to have representation too, and they need to be paying very close attention to how regulation is changing and how larger players in this are trying to move things.
And how about the people? What do we individually all need to be doing? Do we have a chance? Are there tools and services? What do we need to be doing here?
People are a more interesting question. The people are a more interesting question. I think, everybody just deserves to get educated on sort of where their data is. I think for too long, it's been quite easy for us to just be lax about certain things with regards to our data, right? We've heard about breaches, Equifax, all the way up to Cambridge Analytica and things like that. I think with the way that technology is developing, with the way the quantum computing is on the rise and things like that, I think breaches are going to become increasingly harmful to individuals, probably in ways that we haven't seen before. And so I think it would do people well to be a bit more vigilant. And I know that Apple is creating new standards for their data protection and privacy. We'll see what comes of that. But I think the big companies will also recognize this need among the people and start to try and help them meet it for a competitive advantage. But ultimately, it has to be up to individuals to know what's best for them and to know how to protect themselves. And I think the only way to do that is just to educate yourself about the sort of risks that that your activity is creating.
Right. And then do what you can to the extent that you can to protect yourself, and whether or not it's using certain types of utilities, not engaging in certain types of behavior, or if you so choose, go in there with eyes wide open.
I'd say so too. And I think another thing that individuals can do is pay attention to the regulatory developments, right? Because if people don't make their voices heard, right, then the large lobbied tech players will run roughshod over their interests. Right. And so they definitely need to, be educated, not just for themselves and their own affairs, but so they can have a perspective and a voice when it comes to ballot initiatives. So they're not just totally blindsided by what's happening, right? And all sorts of things like that.
Well, Justin, this was absolutely fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm hoping we can do more of this down the road as things evolve and as you land in your new practice.
I appreciate it, Michael. Thanks so much. It's
Thank
great
you very
talking
much. All right, thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.